So welcome everybody to our workshop this afternoon on LGBTQ 101. We're talking about gender identity and sexual orientation as church leaders. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Reverend Brian Ellison. He is the Executive Director of Covenant Network of Presbyterians. He also is the stated clerk for Heartland Presbytery, as well as the Synod of Mid-America. They're just above us. They have Kansas and Missouri, so they're just above our Synod of the Sun. Not only that, Brian's a big baseball fan. Of course, he likes those guys that wear royal blue, but you know, that's okay. we'll let him do that. But I'd like to welcome Brian to our workshop, and it's all yours now, Brian.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and I appreciate you mentioning the baseball. I know better than to make any comments at all about the Astros, unless they are entirely positive. So worthy rivals, and it's a pleasure to play them when we have the opportunity. It is really wonderful to be with you all. It was a real privilege to preach virtually at your Presbytery meeting this summer, and I'm grateful for the invitation to be back in this way to talk a little bit broadly about gender identity and sexual orientation and what we as church leaders, particularly in a presbytery, might want to be thinking about when we think about those things. There's really not time for everyone to go around and introduce themselves, but I want to ask a few things about you. So I can see a lot of you on the screen. I'm not in speaker view. So tell me, how many of you are ruling elders? Looking, a lot of you. Okay. How many of you are teaching elders, ministers? Okay. How many of you are actively serving congregations, either as teaching elders or ruling elders? All right. So a lot of you. How many of you feel extremely familiar and comfortable with issues of sexual orientation and gender identity? And how many of you feel like you have a lot to learn in that department? Okay, well, I appreciate your honesty, and that's helpful. I think there will be something for everyone, whether you've talked about this a lot through the years or you have not talked about it very much. I hope there's also some room for good questions and conversation. And so let me encourage you to put your questions in the chat. You can put them privately to Lynn if you don't want everyone to see them, or you can put them so that everyone can see them, and Lynn will help me navigate those along the way. I don't mind being interrupted, so we can take some questions along the way. I will try to leave some time at the end for more questions and conversation to whatever extent folks want to have that. Here's what I plan to talk about today. I'm going to start by just walking through a brief word about what sexual orientation and gender identity are. For some, that might feel like review, but I actually have never been in a group that felt like they didn't have something to learn or some understanding to grow in what some of the words mean that we use when we're talking about gender and sexuality. I'll also offer kind of a brief review of the way the Presbyterian Church has talked about and dealt with these issues through the decades. It'll be a super brief review because we could talk about that for months, but we'll give a quick overview. And then we'll move into talking about the present reality in presbyteries around the country, in presbyteries like yours. What are some of the ways that elders and ministers are dealing with these issues today? What are the questions they're facing? And now that we're not voting on things every year at General Assembly on these topics, what is there still to talk about? And I would say there's still a lot that we have to work on in ministry with and for the fullness of God's people. We'll also talk about ways that, a few key ways for providing safe or welcoming space. And we'll have some time for you to share experiences and questions as well. I do want to say, I don't assume that everybody on this call shares the same opinions about these issues. These are issues that the Presbyterian Church has has had and has welcomed a variety of understandings about for many years. And one of the real challenges, as you'll hear me say here in a little bit, is finding ways to talk together about difficult issues. Sometimes we Presbyterians have done that well, and sometimes we have not. I hope that this call is a safe space, even for folks who have a range of views. I don't think that this call or this topic today is about trying to argue or persuade people of a viewpoint. I think this is about how we can be effective in ministry as a church for all people, even knowing that we're a church with diverse views. And so that's what we'll be trying to talk about today. Let me start by what we are talking about here and these basic terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. And again, if this feels like review, I encourage you to just listen for new ways to talk about things that maybe you already feel like you know about. Sexual orientation describes to whom a person is sexually attracted, and often also emotionally or romantically attracted. It is a description of who someone is attracted to. It's understood today to be the result of a variety of factors, but not a matter of choice purely by the individual. So that's why we don't use the term sexual preference. You've sometimes heard that probably, but it isn't a preference. It's there's a lot of folks who would prefer to be something else, but the reality is that this is how they are oriented, and that's the term that we use. It also does not describe necessarily a person's practices or behavior. So a person might choose to act out their sexuality in ways that don't reflect their attractions for a variety of reasons. And also, we don't necessarily assume that a person is sexually active simply because they happen to have a particular sexual orientation. Another thing that is important to know about sexual orientation is that it is on a spectrum. And so there was a time where we thought of a person as being on a binary. You are gay or you are straight. But today we recognize that people have a variety of sexual orientations that sometimes are inclusive of more than one spot on that spectrum. And so we avoid binary terminology, at least exclusively binary terminology, to describe sexual orientation. Here's some of the words, and a lot of folks ask me when they're being honest, you know, LGBTQIA, I don't understand what all those letters stand for. We're going to try to unpack some of what those letters stand for. L, lesbian, means women who are attracted to women. G, gay, is men who are attracted to men, or sometimes that word is used more generically, without regard to gender, to refer to people who are attracted to others of the same gender. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. Bisexual is what the B in the alphabet there stands for, and bisexual is a person who is attracted to people of either gender or both genders. This term is becoming less used, I will tell you, and part of that is when I said a moment ago about binaries. There's an intentionality that has developed about not assuming people to be necessarily exclusively binary in terms of gender either, and so bisexual is a term that isn't used as much, but what it means is that a person could be attracted to someone who is either male or female. And then there are other terms that refer to orientation. So you've probably heard the term heterosexual or straight. That would be a person, obviously, who is attracted to someone of the opposite gender. Asexual is a term that is used with increasing frequency. Asexual describes a person who is not sexually attracted to others. That doesn't mean that they aren't romantically or emotionally attracted to people, but they are a person who doesn't experience sexual attraction. And then finally, they're pansexual. This is a term that's actually becoming somewhat more common instead of bisexual. It simply says that a person's sexual attraction to other people is not rooted in that person's gender, and is not limited to one gender identity. Looking to see if there are any questions about any of that. Feel free to put them in the chat if there are. let's talk about gender identity very briefly. Gender, of course, is different than sex. Sex is a description of our biological anatomy. It's the thing that when a child is born, the doctor can say, the sex of this child is this. But gender is a matter of self-understanding. It's how we identify. It describes the set of physical, emotional, cultural traits that we most identify with. And that self-understanding is really important because you cannot necessarily look at a person and say, this is what their gender identity is. You might be able to talk about their gender expression, which is how they portray themselves, the culturally bound traits that might involve clothing or makeup or how a person talks or how a person walks, ways that a person might present themselves. But that doesn't necessarily tell you, without conversation, what a person's gender identity is. Gender identity is also understood to be the result of a variety of factors, but also not simply a matter of conscious choice by an individual. And people who have experienced what is called gender dysphoria, where their gender identity does not match the sex they are born with, will tell you that that it is not a matter of choice for them in most cases. It is not a matter of preference, but it is very real and deep within them that they identify as something other than the sex that they were born with. The other point here is similar to what I said about sexual orientation. On a spectrum, it's on a spectrum rather than binary, and it can evolve over time. It can change, can be fluid. And so a person might, for a part of their life, identify as their biological sex, might identify that as their gender, but at some point they may come to a different understanding and may want to express that understanding differently. As I said, it's also true that gender identity is not always visible to others. It's also true that it's not necessarily related to sexual orientation. You can be a transgender woman who is attracted to men. You can be a transgender woman who is attracted to women. The orientation and the identity are two different matters. There's a question in the chat. Someone has chatted with Lynn asking about the T and the Q, and I'm about to give you those answers. So you've asked, these questions are timely. So what are some of the words for gender identity? Cisgender is a word that's a fairly recent English word. If you don't know cisgender, don't feel bad. It wasn't around about 20 years ago. But cisgender is a person whose gender identity matches their biological sex. I am cisgender. I am male by my biological sex, and I identify as male. So that makes me a cisgender man. Transgender is a person whose gender identity differs from their biological sex. Though I was born with the anatomical characteristics of a male, if I understood myself to be female, I would be a transgender woman. Does that make sense? The word, by the way, is transgender. It is an adjective. It can also be a noun, but it is not transgendered. That is an older way of using that word, but it is no longer used. More common, I think, increasingly is the phrase gender non-binary, recognizing that trans sort of implies you've gone from one to the other. But a lot of folks identify as somewhere in between, or they say gender isn't that important to them, or they refuse to accept the categories of male or female. There's some things about them that feel like some of each. That person might call themselves gender non-binary. They might call themselves gender queer. They might call themselves NB, and a lot of younger trans folks are actually have turned that into a word, NB, ENBY. So you can, these terms are all generally acceptable, and when they're used in affirming ways, it's okay for other people to use them. But if any of those words make you uncomfortable, I guess my encouragement is that you don't have to use them. That's okay too. Some other words to know. So the T stood for transgender. The Q stands for queer. Queer is a sort of a catch-all word. It's for people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identity. It does not require them to specify exactly what they mean. You know, people who are not queer, who have been living as cisgender heterosexual people for their whole lives, don't have to go around explaining that they are cisgender heterosexual people, and that means that I'm a male sex who identifies as a male who's attracted to men. And so the word queer sort of recognizes that maybe you don't want to get so specific. Maybe you don't feel like you should have to identify all of those categories for people when they ask. Queer is an inclusive term. A lot of folks have felt like queer is a derogatory term, and indeed, of course, that is its origin, right? That folks used it as a put down. It is like a lot of words that were once used as insults. The community itself has sort of recaptured this one and claimed its power. So now you see queer studies departments in universities. If you go to the bookstore, there's a queer authors aisle. It is. Do people still go to bookstores? That reference may be dated. I'll stop saying that. Queer is an inclusive word that is not offensive. Again, if it makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to use it. But know that people who are using it are not inherently being offensive or derogatory. We can just throw out one other word here. This is the one that starts with I. So in the Presbyterian Church's official terminology now, we're saying LGBTQIA. The I is intersex. Intersex refers to people whose biological anatomy is not entirely male or female. This is a medical word. I mean, this is a biological word. And believe it or not, that actually applies to 1 in 1,000 births in the United States. It's a lot more common than people recognize. Some other letters that sometimes get in there and ways that people want to identify: questioning, Q. There's sometimes more than one Q. A person who is expressing that they're not certain where they've landed. And A, in addition to standing for asexual, sometimes stands for allies. People who want to identify with the community because of their support, but are not necessarily saying something about their orientation or their gender identity. Julie asks in the chat if there's a term for people born with ambiguous genitalia, and that word is intersex. That's at least one of the terms for that. Any other questions at this point? All right, well, we'll go on, but don't feel like we can't circle back to answer some other questions. I want to talk a little bit about the Presbyterian Church's journey with these issues, which has been long and complicated and sometimes painful for people on all sides of the conversation. I recognize that I didn't do very much to introduce myself at the start of this conversation, and this is probably a good point to do that. I am a minister and I am a stated clerk, like Lynn said, but I entered into ministry in 1999 when I graduated from seminary. I was a pastor of a church in the Kansas City area for 13 years. And my own story is that I am gay, but I was not being very honest with myself about the time I started seminary. And by the time I had graduated from seminary, the Presbyterian Church had adopted a prohibition on the ordination of LGBT people. It made it very complicated for me then to become more honest with myself than I had been before. So after I was ordained and when I was serving a church, when I finally sort of had to admit to myself, this is who I am, I found myself in a bit of a quandary. Do I come out to the church? Do I let the shoe drop, let the chips fall where they may and see how it could blow up the church? I didn't feel like that was faithful. Do I just walk away? You know, we're in the middle of a building project. We just called an associate pastor. The church was growing. People were happy. That didn't seem faithful either. And in the end, I ended up staying in the closet as a minister for many years, until actually after 13 years, after the church's policy had changed, I came out. I became executive director of the Covenant Network, and left that congregation, which would have been supportive of me, but also would have had a really turbulent and difficult conversation to have in some of those earlier years. I share that part of my story because it's just one example of the complexity that ministers and elders and deacons and lay people were facing through the years of the church's conversations around sexuality. Those conversations really began, I think, honestly, in the 60s and 70s in earnest. They were not new in the 1990s, but a lot of folks point to the late 1970s, 1978, when the Church's General Assembly adopted what was called the definitive guidance, which said that, quote, self-avowed, unrepentant, practicing homosexuals could not be ordained in the church. And while there were elements of that decision that actually felt like a compromise at the time, that is, that it was trying to say this only applied to people's practice, it only applied to self-avowed gay and lesbian people. In fact, it had the effect of driving LGBTQ people into the closet in the church or driving them out of the church. And the debate raged on, often without key voices at the table. In 1997, the Presbyterian Church added to its Book of Order language that was explicit in its prohibition of ordaining those who did not practice fidelity in marriage between a man and a woman or chastity in singleness. The church tried several times to debate that issue, and in fact, the General Assembly voted to remove that language from the Book of Order several times during the 2000s, 2001, 2008, but the presbyteries didn't approve that change. In 2011, finally they did, and the language of fidelity and chastity was replaced with language that requires all candidates for ordination to be examined for their calling, their gifts, their preparation, and their suitability for the responsibilities. It didn't require anyone to be ordained. It simply allowed it and required that each person be considered individually in the fullness of who they are. Similarly, the church prohibited same-sex marriage. There was language in the Book of Order that said marriage is a civil contract between a man and a woman. That language was in the Book of Order until 2015, when presbyteries approved a change in that language to say marriage involves a unique commitment between two people, traditionally a man and a woman. And that language, of course, as a lot of language at the General Assembly, was full of compromise and trying to include a range of views. But the effect of it was to open the possibility that sessions could authorize same-sex marriages in their church, and ministers were free to perform them, but no one was required to. And that remains the policy of the church today. The church has not completely finished talking about these issues, though I think it's fair to say that we have not had any votes or controversies quite like the ones that surrounded marriage and ordination since then. A really significant thing the church did do, though, and it's relevant for what we are talking about here today, is it took several steps in 2018 to call the church to pay attention to its ministry of hospitality and evangelism and welcome and seeking justice for people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. So they passed a resolution at the 2018 General Assembly that affirmed the gifts of LGBTQIA+ people for ministry and celebrated their service in the church and in the world. So where those earlier decisions had said, okay, you can ordain LGBTQ people if you want to, this one actually said, and they have gifts for ministry, and that can be a good thing. The assembly also called on everyone in the church to actively work for the protection of human and civil rights for people of diverse sexual identities, and it encouraged congregations and councils, like presbyteries, to continually seek to expand their welcome. And maybe most incredibly of all, the assembly approved this on the consent agenda. Not a single commissioner removed it and wanted to have a debate or a vote on it. So that was a sign for sure to us that times have changed in the church. Similarly, that same assembly adopted a resolution that affirmed the dignity and humanity of people of all gender identities. It specifically named transgender people and gender non-binary people and called for their inclusion in all human rights, their giftedness for service, and called on the church to expand its welcome. And then it went on to actually list some things that would actually give that effect. Ways that transgender inclusion could be lived out in our congregations and in our Presbyterian institutions. So for example, the assembly named welcoming statements that specifically name transgender and gender non-binary people. It mentioned policies that are inclusive of people across the spectrum. It mentioned available facilities such as bathrooms. It mentioned paying attention to the language we use in worship and liturgy and hymns. And it talked about respecting and using people's pronouns properly. We'll talk a little more about that down the road. Are there any, I'm going to pause though again, are there questions? I feel like I'm talking a lot. All right. There will be time at the end as well. So even though the church has taken these steps, votes have been cast, sometimes even policies have been made, it's fair to ask how inclusive we really are. In the present reality of the church, and I'm speaking to you today specifically as a presbytery gathering, so knowing that you are, almost all of you are leaders of churches in one way or another. The reality is that many congregations and presbyteries have sort of moved on from these votes. They were delighted when we finished voting and have stopped having these controversial meetings. But when we stopped doing that, in a lot of places, we also stopped taking practical steps to put this theoretical welcome that we voted on into action. And so we didn't really live into the changes we said were so important. Moreover, I think we assumed that just because we weren't talking about it anymore, that we had come to some sort of consensus or agreement. And that I don't think is necessarily true. There are a lot of councils that have never really had conversations about what this commitment to inclusion means, much less celebrated the gifts of LGBTQIA+ people. And in fact, there are a lot of presbyteries that have not ordained or installed any out queer people. I was at a gathering of mid-council leaders with Lynn a year ago and had led a workshop on this topic. And I asked this group of mostly presbytery executives and stated clerks, I had a kind of a working theory in my head that I thought something like 40% of our presbyteries had out LGBTQ ministers serving churches. And I said, is that too low? Are we actually doing better than that? And every person there said, anecdotally, that is too high, that the real number is less than a third of our presbyteries have actively out queer pastors in them. And that's, we're almost a decade from the time when it became legal in our church to do that. So it's a question of how well we're living into those changes. And again, I'm not assuming that everyone here agrees on this, and I'm not saying that every presbytery has to do everything the same way, but it does raise the question of whether we are fully living into to this open discernment and this trusting in the process that we said we had. The other thing that I have discovered in the work with the Covenant Network, which a lot of that work is or was before COVID, traveling around to presbyteries and congregations and having these conversations, a lot of congregations still are very divided without knowing how to talk about it or without wanting to talk about it. Maybe even most troubling of all, there's a lot of members of presbyteries and congregations who recognize that they hold a minority viewpoint and thus don't feel free to speak about it. And the impact of our not really engaging these issues, of hoping that they'll go away, is obviously a lack of engagement, but it's a disruption to our community. there are people in our community, queer people, and also those who love them, who feel cut off, who feel rejected when we, as a community, are not able to really talk about what it means to live into inclusion. I would go so far as to say that compromises our mission and our ministry, our ability to do the things that we're called to do in proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ as the church. So, what do we do about it? What is the work of church leaders today, and why are you a good group of people for me to be talking with about this? I would argue that presbyteries and the people who come to presbytery meetings are the most important group right now for fostering a different understanding in the church around these issues. It is easy to forget what presbyteries are, and I'm speaking generally and generically of presbyteries as though you aren't all one presbytery. The Presbytery of New Covenant, I happen to know, is a good and joyful place. You do a lot of amazing things, and from what I can tell, you seem to like each other. That's a good thing, and isn't always true of every presbytery, believe it or not. But even so, we sometimes, even the best presbyteries, can forget what they're about. Sometimes we feel like we're regulatory bodies. Our job is to sort of stand at the gate and enforce the rules. Has it ever felt like that at presbytery? Maybe other presbyteries you've been involved in. Maybe that's where it's happened. Sometimes they feel like debating clubs. But I have long been arguing that our Presbyterian polity really says that our councils can and should be covenant communities. We are not about the decisions we make or the way we make the decisions so much as we are about the community that is created when we come together and the mission and ministry that happens as a result. And so when we're talking about sexuality and about gender identity, one of the things that I think we have the opportunity to do as presbyteries is bring people together with people who are theologically informed, even with different views on difficult issues. We have the ability to foster something dynamic and different that really can't happen in one congregation that's more homogenous or a smaller group of people, or at least it's harder for that to happen. We have a unique opportunity as presbyteries to do that. We also have an opportunity, I think, to adopt policies and take actions that translate our good intentions, our process matters, and our polity decisions from General Assembly 9 years ago. We have the opportunity to put those into effect with policies that actually affect people's lives, the way we run our camps and conferences, the way we run our retreats and events, the way we provide resources to congregations for their own worship and mission and service. I also think we in presbyteries have an opportunity to sustain learning and growth over an extended period of time. Pastors come and go from churches, but the presbytery lives on. We have this opportunity to sort of set a standard and a set of expectations and a framework that builds and promotes the gospel in its fullness over time and across congregations. I'm going to share some of what I think are current issues and challenges, but I want to ask you now intentionally to put in the chat some of what you think are the current challenges you face, either in your congregation or as a presbytery, in addressing issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. These can be big, broad challenges, or these can be just very specific issues that you're dealing with. But please feel free to put those in the chat, because I want to make sure that we're addressing some of the things that are on your mind and heart. There are a lot of current issues and challenges across the denomination. One that I think is I am aware is something that is on your agenda is, how do we intentionally care for transgender and gender non-binary people? I think there's a lot of different pieces of this. There are churches that are that simply don't think this is important, and that's certainly one group of churches. But there are also churches that think it's important, want to do the right thing, but don't understand transgender people, don't understand gender identity. And then there's, I think, even a third group that might even have a good understanding, but just doesn't know where to start. What are the specific things we need to do as a church, as a community, to show our love and affirmation of all of God's people, including those who identify as transgender or gender non-binary? There are resources available to help. This is something we can help with, but it does require intentionality on the part of communities coming together to take those steps. I'm going to talk a little more about that one in just a second. There's some other challenges that I would name. The impact of pastors coming out in their particular context. Maybe this will surprise you. I don't think it will. That when the denomination changed its policy in 2011, that did not mean that every closeted LGBTQ minister could simply suddenly start telling everyone that they were gay. That there's a whole network of complications that for a lot of people still kept that from being possible. Even now, the decision to come out is a very complicated and very personal decision. And there are people who do not feel like they can come out as part of their ordination process, even though the church theoretically says they can be ordained. What do we do when someone has been ordained and is already in faith communities, but now feels like now they should be honest about who they are with everyone around them? What are the implications of that for the ministry of congregations and for relationships in the presbytery? These are issues that we're still figuring out. Another real need is for LGBTQIA plus candidates for ministry, as well as ministers already ordained but who are seeking new calls. How do you connect candidates for positions with churches that would be welcoming and affirming of them? It's a particularly complicated question for those who identify as gay and who are out, but who don't want that to be the first or only thing that a potential congregation knows about them. As one candidate put it to me just in a conversation last week, I don't want to be their gay pastor, I want to be their pastor. But how do you share this important, true information about yourself without sending the message that this is the only thing you care about? It's a whole set of questions that heterosexual candidates for ministry do not have to think about. And it remains a really complex issue for people in our churches right now. Let's see what some of the others are. Wow, great. A lot of them here in the chat box. Let's see here. A couple of you mentioned conservative mindset, very conservative members. And there is no doubt that there are, really in probably all of our churches, members who have different views about sexuality and gender identity. One of the things that I have found really important in these conversations is to listen to one another, but to make sure that we are really hearing and this is to folks on both sides, that we are really hearing what it is that is desired. What are the underlying principles at stake? I often find that conservatives in churches around these issues are afraid of something happening. They're afraid that the gospel will somehow be compromised. They're afraid that that people will stop coming to their church if they find out that it affirms gay people. They're afraid that they're going to be seen as doing something wrong. I think it's really helpful for all of us to look to why we think this is important. I have always said that this is not just a matter of justice. It is certainly that. It is a matter of fairness and rights for all people, but it's also a matter of evangelism. It's a matter of making the church, the body of Christ, truly welcoming of all. It's a matter of introducing people to the good news of Jesus Christ who are going to turn away from it if they are told it's not for them, or it's not for their child, or it's not for their sibling. I think the other piece that has been helpful to me in connecting with conservative members is understanding that that sometimes one is not really encountering opposition so much as the need for time and respect for the reality that these issues, a lot has changed in the last few years, that some things have changed really fast. And sometimes it's just helpful to honor that this is about more than just flipping a switch. This is about changing how we see the world. And when we can be honest about that, sometimes folks will come along more than we might think they will. Lonnie says the vocabulary. Youth and young adults use it, but the older generations do not know it and get confused. True. Hopefully, this kind of event is one way that we make a little bit of progress about that. And education is really important. I think one thing I will say about education around issues of sexuality and orientation is that we should not place the burden of that education on the group, on queer people, that those who are straight, those who are cisgender, should take it upon themselves to do a little self-education. This is a similar observation to what you might hear if you've been through anti-racism training. The burden of learning about injustice and systemic racism and privilege should not fall entirely on people of color to help white people understand it. Similarly, I think it's really important that we work hard as a community to understand and not expect the first same-sex couple that walks up to our church and wants to be married to do all that education for us. New Covenant, someone says, Rebecca says, New Covenant had a gathering of leaders interested in participating in Pride Houston. Some of us weren't sure if our own congregations would be truly welcoming. And that is a really great point, Rebecca, that I do workshops on how to be a welcoming church, how to tell people you're a welcoming church, because there's all these churches that say, we would love to have gay people. There just aren't any here. How do we tell them that they're welcome here? Do we put a pride flag outside? Do we put a note on the front of our bulletin? There's a lot of things you can do, and we can talk about that in some other workshop. But the first thing you need to do is to make sure you're really as welcoming as you think you are if you're going to tell people you are. And the worst thing we can do in terms of a ministry of inclusion is invite people into a situation, essentially trick them into a place where we tell them they will be welcomed and then instead they get pushed away. So that's a good question to ask, Rebecca. I think, and I think it's really important that that a lot of careful ground building from the ground up happen before we just sort of charge into the sort of high profile rainbow flags and pride parades. We need to make sure that that's really who we are. I'm going to look through these, and Lynn, if you have one or two that you want to really lift up, I welcome your guidance.
Brian, some have suggested they'd like to know particular scriptures to read or a biblical hermeneutic, and so because the 6 verses that are known as the clobber verses are often misinterpreted, or words were added into a more recent translation back in the 50s. But if you could perhaps talk about the biblical side, often that's what someone in a particular mindset would say, well, but the Bible says this, and they're going to say this is sinful behavior.
That too could be an entire workshop in and of itself, or several workshops. But in general, let me tell you a couple of things about how I answer that. One is that in our Reformed tradition, in the Presbyterian tradition, one of our key principles of scriptural interpretation is that Scripture interprets Scripture. When we are reading the Bible and we come to things that don't seem that don't make sense to us, or that need further understanding, when there's apparent contradiction, we have to read any individual verse against the broader context of the whole of the Old and New Testaments. What are the overarching principles that might help us make sense of these these individual verses that seem to suggest something immoral or wrong about particular sexual practices. I think the overarching principles of the scripture to me are love, God's love for the world, God's love for humanity, and the love that God calls human beings to have for one another. I think that theme of love is so pervasive in the scriptures that anything that reads as though it suggests God doesn't love, or that love between people is a bad thing, can't be consistent with the whole of the scriptural witness. People who support the inclusion of LGBTQ people in the church do not reject the Bible. They are calling on people to read the whole of the scriptures and understand 6 verses in light of that broader context. I don't reject even those 6 verses. I mean, I want you to know, I think those verses, each of them has to be understood. And again, you could study these in much greater depth. There certainly was, but maybe the thing I would point toward that applies to all of those 6 verses is that 2,000 years ago or longer, there was no understanding of a lot of what I shared in the first part of this presentation. There was no understanding of sexual orientation. There was no thought that a person could be gay. And there certainly was no thought that that marriage could be practiced by 2 people of the same gender. It simply wasn't on their radar. The Bible couldn't say that you can't do something that they couldn't imagine even existing. When the Bible speaks specifically of sexual acts between people of the same sex, it is speaking of practices that were inherently exploitive, temple prostitution, men who were older men who were scholars who would essentially offer to teach younger men, boys, but would pay them, or would expect to be paid with sexual activity. Things that we would recognize immediately as wrong, that all of us would agree are exploitive and wrong. That's what the Bible is condemning. The Bible is not condemning 2 people who are oriented to same-sex attraction, falling in love, and deciding to commit their lives to each other, including sexual practice. That is just not something the Bible could have imagined. And so to say that the Bible condemns it, I would argue is a misreading of the Bible, is reading something into the Bible that isn't there. That's a very brief hermeneutic. I guess the other thing I would say in answer to that question, though, is that a lot of folks want to get you into an argument about the Bible. I do this professionally. I'm a professional gay. And for the last 9 years of doing this, I have never once convinced a person through argument to support my view of sexuality. I'll say that again. In all the years I've been doing this, I have never argued anyone into their vote. What I have done is shared stories. I have built relationships. I have invited people to look on their fellow human beings and their fellow people in the church and to extend to them love and hospitality and grace and kindness. And over time, hearts and minds have been opened. So one of the things I will say is that, yes, I know all of those biblical arguments, and it sometimes is important to be able to talk about those as people try to get their head around the issues. But in the end, it's not about winning an argument. It's about building a relationship that eventually changes things. I do see there are questions here about restroom signage, and I can talk about that here in just a second. I'm looking at the clock. Let me come back to some of these questions, but let me go through one more slide here, which is about specifically the question, because I get this so much. This is a question that every church group wants to talk about right now. So I'm just building it into what I talk about in the first place. And that's, what does it mean to provide safe space for transgender and non-binary people. I think there's some very basic things, and I don't think I don't think this represents a particular theological viewpoint, to be honest. I don't think this represents there's no church that is too conservative to do the things that I'm suggesting on this screen. This is something that we should basically expect of each other, no matter who we are. I'd start with the importance of being sensitive to and accepting of a person's self-understanding. This idea that I don't get to decide who you are. You get to decide who you are. And I take your word for it. I honor you according to your self-understanding. And if I think in the back of my head, that I don't understand that, or I think in the back of my head, do they know what they're saying? It doesn't really matter, does it? It's your life. You get to decide. And so I think these principles begin with the importance of affirming that that basic Christian hospitality, basic kindness and love includes affirming a person in who they are. Second, as I said, sort of on another topic earlier, the burden of sensitivity is not on the transgender or non-binary person. Most trans people have already experienced a great deal of hurt. And I don't mean to paint a picture of people who are to be pitied. That isn't what I mean. We just need to be honest about the fact that there is a history of violence and of discrimination and of rejection among people whose gender identity has differed from others or has differed from their sexual, from their sex. Transgender youth, the mental health professionals estimate that 1 in 3 transgender youth will attempt suicide. 1 in 3. And that is not from left-wing advocates. That is what mental health professionals say. And the number's actually higher for transgender people of color. So this is a matter of people's lives and death. It is not just a matter of sort of being politically correct. It is a matter of our care for people. When we talk about pronouns or about names, a transgender person, that really matters. Words matter because the words say, I care about you enough to affirm you, to be sensitive to you in the ways that you have asked me to. It is an acknowledgement that I see them, that I listen to them. And we all want that. If there's a person who just constantly gets your name wrong, after a while, you know how that makes you feel. Like, do you not care enough about me to get my name right? That's particularly true if the name was attached to a life that was painful. So if a person asks to be addressed by a different name than the one they were born with, because they've understood themselves to be of a different gender, that is something we should honor, and similarly with the pronouns. More broadly, in our churches, I guess one of the things I want to suggest is that we specify genders a lot of times when we really don't need to. Why ever do we need to have the men sing one verse and women sing the next verse? We don't have to do that. We could have the left side of the room sing it and then the right side of the room. Or we could have higher voices and lower voices. There's a lot of different ways we can do things that don't require us to specify gender. I think there's a lot of Bible studies, fellowship groups that we have over the centuries had gender specific that may not need to be. What are the Presbyterian men doing that a gender non-binary person or a woman could not be part of? Or for that matter, the PW. I think these are questions we should be asking. Basic principles of hospitality is what I'm asking for, what I'm suggesting. It's the golden rule. It's treating other people the way you would want to be treated. And it is incumbent on us to take the initiative to do that when it comes to people who have already experienced oppression and exclusion and trauma. And finally, now that I've spent an entire screen talking about this group of people in terms mainly of their gender identity, I want to encourage you to acknowledge the fullness of a person's identity, not just their gender. Just like the person who doesn't want to be the gay pastor of the church, they want to be the pastor. Let's acknowledge that the transgender person who comes to your congregation or who goes to a youth retreat or who shows up at camp is probably there because they want to do archery and be in a Bible study, not because they wanted to have a big conversation about which cabin they're sleeping in or which bathroom they're going to use. So it is about honoring the fullness of a person's identity, and that's the most important thing I think we can do. All right, let me take some more questions. Lynn, do you see some you want to highlight?
I do, particularly the last one. How are we doing denominationally in terms of inclusion, in terms of demographics? Do we know that there are more folks that are being ordained as ruling elders or deacons or in ministry? Church membership? Are there new studies for Christian education? Where can we look to see how we're doing denominationally?
The short answer is we don't know. We don't have data. We have not begun collecting data. So the statistical reports, clerks of session, the statistical reports. It doesn't ask how many of your members are gay. It doesn't ask how many of your members are transgender. So we don't know exactly, and we also don't know, except anecdotally, how many openly LGBTQIA plus teaching elders or deacons we have. Now I will answer you anecdotally. We have a lot more than we used to, but we don't have that many. As a percentage of our overall numbers, it's still a vanishingly small number. And perhaps even more of a problem is that, so Heartland Presbytery, where I serve, is a fairly progressive presbytery. We have out LGBT people serving both in churches and in validated ministries. So I would say we're pretty progressive. Of our 182 teaching elder members, 4 of us are out LGBTQ people, and we're a fairly progressive presbytery. So it's a small number. There was how we're doing denominationally in terms of programming for this group. We do now have a person in Louisville in the Office of Gender and Racial Justice Ministries, whose focus is on gender equity, and that has been interpreted to broadly include issues of sexuality. That person put together an event, kind of a closed event for out LGBTQ teaching elders, and there were about 50 people on the call from around the country. I don't know if that's an accurate number or not, but it's still not a very high number. Elders and deacons, anecdotally, obviously there's more than that, but it's still, it's hard to know how fully they are being included in the life and leadership of their churches, their presbyteries, their synods, and the General Assembly. In terms of like Christian ed studies, I think there's a lot of really good material coming out of the Presbyterian Publishing Corporation, but not, for example, a basic sexuality curriculum. We still don't have one of those. At least we haven't in about 25 years. And even then it was incredibly controversial and nothing was allowed to be included that was even remotely sensitive. So we have a ways to go, is my short answer to this question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? What's the actual wording of the policy up for vote on 1121? That information is available. I sent it out to your pastors and clerks of session. It will also be included in the presbytery materials for next week. The person who's asking if you'd like to include your email address here, or I probably have that within the registration. I can send it directly to you. Basically, it's asking for us to be inclusive around people that are transgender, and to work with having them housed with people of the gender with which they identify that may or may not match their anatomical parts. And so you can imagine that there's a lot of study and conversation around this topic right now, which is part of why Brian is with us. Any other questions? There's Brian's contact information.
And can I just say, Lynn,
Sure.
one of the things I would love to do is have more conversation with you individually, if that's helpful. I can also speak with congregations or sessions, if that's helpful. And Lynn can help you get my contact information if you don't get it off this screen right now. When the Covenant Network is up and about again, and along with the rest of the world, I would love to connect with the presbytery in person. But in the meantime, please feel free to reach out anytime that is where I can be helpful to you.
And there are other resources on the Covenant Network website. And so most of them are written. We're hoping to perhaps include this video within that to be able to offer it to folks who are more visual rather than want to read a book.
Yes.
And so if there's no other questions, I would like to certainly thank Brian for his time this afternoon, for his very clear explanation, and just pray that it has been helpful for you as participants. We do have one question saying, are there books appropriate for study or small groups?
Yeah, I think there are a number of them, and it depends on what specific topic you want to address. But I would, our website does have some good resources, and I'd be glad to commend particular things if there are particular questions. So let me know if there are some specifics.
Okay, super. Yeah, we can pull them. Actually, I sent the website out as a resource to our pastors and clerks when we initially sent out the letter and the policy. So if there's no other questions, thank you, Brian, for being with us. I'm seeing lots of thanks here in the chat, and thank you all for participating in this. I think it's, the world is changing, and we as adults, we as Christians, we as Presbyterians need to recognize that and look at how we actually are welcoming and how we actually are inclusive of people of all races, of all genders, of all orientations, because hopefully we are people that choose welcome.
Amen.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everyone. It was good to be with you. Bye-bye.